Hi, you're listening to the Child Wellbeing Podcast, and this episode is called Growing Up, Competence Development and Social Opportunities. I am Tanya, and today we're going to talk to Dr. Marlies Buchmann, a researcher at the Swiss Survey on Children and Youth, also known as COCON. This project takes place at the Jacobs Center for Productive Youth Development at the University of Zurich. Professor Buchmann, welcome to the Child Wellbeing Podcast.
Thank you very much.
Can you tell us what the COCON study is about?
I'm very happy to present you the Swiss Longitudinal Survey of Children and Youth, also known as COCON study. Like the Z-Process study, the COCON study originated in the national research program by the Swiss National Science Foundation, Children, Youth and intergenerational relationships. And the National Science Foundation wanted to have a longitudinal survey of children and youth. And, that was competitive. You had to, put in your research proposal, and then we were chosen to do this longitudinal survey on children and youth based on the concept we proposed then. And that was at the time when the Jacobs Center came into the being. And so this, of course, a longitudinal study on children and youth needs some stable environment. So, the Jacobs Center was the perfect, institution to host this study. And so, given that it was or still is at the Jacobs Center, we also profited from, the funding the Jacobs Foundation, gave to the Jacobs Center being, a joint venture with the University of Zurich. So that's kind of the origin of the study. And then we were, funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, and we were also recognized as, a social science infrastructure project. And these are, you can get money if you collect a database, which is kind of expensive, and where the National Science Foundation has an interest that this was continuing. So they fund you for a certain period of years. So this is kind of the background of the study.
What are the major aims of the COCON study? Can you tell us about that?
Now, to the major research aims, the basic idea is to examine the dynamic interplay of young people's competence development and the social opportunities in the context of growing up. So, as you can see, the keywords or key concepts of competence and context also went into the acronym of the studies, the CO from competence and the CON from context, and that's why it's called COCON study.
And can you tell us the relevance of these concepts in the study?
So basically, we want to look at the development of competences, and we have a broad understanding of competences, that includes cognitive competences, but also particularly social competences, and, competences in terms of, competences related to certain tasks and, life sphere, like, willingness to exert effort or, the efficacy and so on. And in terms of context, given that it was surveys of children and youth, we focused on, information on their major contexts of growing up, being like the family, school, the peer context, leisure time, and so on.
Can you tell us how the study was designed?
We selected 3 cohorts. A cohort of the 6-year-olds, 15-year-olds, and 21-year-olds. So COCON is a multi-cohort study. And the reason we chose is 6-year-olds, 15-year-olds, and 21-year-olds is because these ages represent prototypical stages of growing up. 6-year-olds are, middle childhood, 15-year-olds are middle adolescents, and 21-year-olds are, young adults.
So, how did you decide when to survey their children and the young people?
Given the interest in the coping with transitions, we wanted to have a survey wave before an important transition in children's or adolescents' life course would take place, and then we would like to have a survey after this transition, because we are interested in the antecedents of the coping with transitions and the consequences. So that's why, we chose the 6-year-olds, because in Switzerland, that's, the year before they go into school. And when we survey them afterwards, they have made the transition to school. With the 15-year-olds, similar case, 15-year-olds from the normative life course, they should be in the 9th years of schooling, so the last year of lower secondary schooling, and then make the transition to upper secondary school. These transitions mean that, the actor who makes that transition, encounters a new social environment. A child who enters school, enters the school environment. So that's different from, the environment, let's say, in the family. And that, always requires some adaptation processes. And in the sense of new social relationships need to be formed, when the child comes to school, it's now with the classmates, it's with the teachers. So these are kind of, challenges, for the person who makes that transition, and so how well you can make that adaptation.
And what are the particularities of the Swiss system?
In Switzerland, we have a highly stratified education system, compared to, for example, the United States. And so these early transitions, and not only early transitions, but also transitions into tracked, school trajectories of different, academic requirements, sort of, forecloses opportunities, or can foreclose opportunities depending on, the resources, the child and the family, have. And so we were interested in, these processes.
Can you tell us about the survey waves of the study?
The multi-cohort study, and for the scheduling of survey wave. So if there was no transition, in this normative life course, we would have a 3-year interval. So if we take the example of the cohort of the 6-year-olds, so the first survey wave was at the age of 6, the second one at the age of 7, then at the age of 9, and then at age 12, in the Swiss context, where they transition from the primary school to lower secondary school. That's why, we have, another survey wave at 13. Then at age 15, from 12 to 15, this 3-year gap. And then this is a big transition to upper secondary school. And in 2018, we'll have another survey wave of this group. So this is the scheduling, and of course it was similar with the cohort of the 15-year-olds, and the cohort of the 21-year-olds, that's kind of our reference cohort. And the idea was that we would hopefully, continue the study until these 3 cohorts would reach the age of 21.
Can the study illustrate social change?
So the cohort of the 15-year-olds were 15 in the year 2006. From the child cohort, they were 15 in the year 2015, almost a decade later. And when we have done the survey in this spring, we have, a period where we have prospective data on 2 cohorts collected at almost, with a time difference of a decade. And so we can see, whether we would find differences in intra-individual development or individual differences, or whether there, has been changes in the social context.
Can you please give us an example of data patterns that you have found in the data set?
We looked at the conjoint trajectories between the child academic self-concept and the parent educational aspirations from the age of 9 to the age of 15. And, our interest was to examine whether this, develops in tandem, or whether, these academic self-concept of the child and the parental education aspiration, they will kind of diverge as children get older, or whether they would converge. And then, of course, look at, if you find such patterns, look at the antecedents, what determines the trajectory, these conjoint trajectories, and what are the consequences of, the type of conjoint trajectories. So what we did is, mixture modeling, latent class analysis to identify whether there are, such patterns. And we found 4 patterns. So we find one where, the child has a very low, compared to the low academic self-concept, but the parents do not expect or have no, high aspirations. Then you find, the opposite, conjoint trajectories where, both the child academic self-concept is very high, but also the parental education aspirations are high. And then down here you find, 2 interesting, conjoint trajectories. One here, what we call then, over-aspiration. Parents hold up relatively high education aspirations, but the, child and then the adolescent's academic self-concept is pretty low. So what does that mean, in terms of, for example, for the adolescent self-esteem or, or educational outcomes, and what are the antecedents for this type of conjoint trajectories? And here you get the opposite constellation where, parents have pretty low, educational aspiration, but nonetheless, the child and the adolescent hold up, relatively high educational academic self-concept.
What particular features does the COCON study have?
COCON is the first representative longitudinal multi-cohort and multi-informant study of children and adolescents in Switzerland.
What was the sampling strategy used?
We, used a 2-step sampling procedure for selecting a population sample for each cohort. So it's a population sample of 6-year-olds in Switzerland, of 15-year-olds in Switzerland, and of 21-year-olds in Switzerland. And so maybe you would ask the question, why a population sample instead of one based on school classes? Because we have 15-year-olds, we have 6-year-olds. First of all, given the 3 cohorts, you cannot have a school class or sample for 21-year-olds. That's not possible. So you have there would be an individual sampling anyways. But the main reason why we opted for a population sample was because we were interested in these transitions. And if you sample 6-year-old children based on their kindergarten class, or 15 years old based on their, classes in lower secondary education, you would have, this first wave done in school classes, and then you would have the transition, and then, they would go in different ways. So we didn't want to have this lump effect, from the first survey done in classes, and that would follow us, to the entire panel study.
Very interesting. So how did you make the selection then?
In the first step, we selected communities by community type. And community type is based on the typology of the Federal Statistical Office in Switzerland. And, that typology has 22 categories. And, it uses information basically on socioeconomic criteria. So with that, we would have, the residence of the child and or the adolescent and their family based on the residence, with a lot of information about the residence on, the socioeconomic structure. And then, of course, selection by community size. And then in the second step was a random draw of children, in the selected communities, the 6-year-olds, the 15-year-olds and 21-year-olds from the community's resident register. And, we gave highly specific instructions to the resident register on how to select the cases to really achieve a random sample. So that's the rationale and how we did it.
And what criteria did you use to estimate the initial sample size?
So the first criteria was we wanted to have at least 600 respondents in each cohort in the final survey wave at age 21. I mean, as we heard today, that's always, of course, you want to have 6,000, but because, of money restrictions, you cannot go as high as you want. So that's what we said. At the final survey wave at age 21, we want to have retained 600 respondents. That would allow us to do, still do complex multivariate statistical analysis. And we would then have similar statistical power when conducting analysis comparing cohorts. So these were the two criteria. And then second criterion was estimates for participation rate in the first survey wave. So from the initial sample, we got from the residence register what were our expectations, how the proportion we would get for the first survey wave. And so we estimated based on the available studies in Switzerland, said on average we expect 2/3, 65%, with variation, across cohorts. So we expected, the child cohort to have a much higher participation rate than the 21-year-old.
And what about panel retention and panel maintenance?
So what did we do, to keep up panel maintenance? We had two objectives. The first one is, to keep up respondents' motivation and interest in the study. That's, I think, especially with these age groups, one of the most important things. And secondly, we wanted to track the validity of the respondents' addresses. So we could minimize that, people could not be reached because of false addresses.
What did you do to keep the interest in the study?
So for every survey wave, we had an incentive for the child or the adolescent. It was never money. We refused to pay money, but it was always, a gift. So, for example, with the 6-year-olds, we had a 100-piece puzzle we would give them. That was sponsored by Ravensburg, or they could choose between the 100-piece puzzle or kind of these social games, Eile mit Weile, or things like that. And so there were some cute incidences where 6-year-old children would say, "Oh, I cannot decide whether I want the puzzle or want to have this social game." And the ones that were really clever, they said to the interviewer, if I answer the question again, can I have the other? Okay. And then they would always receive birthday cards, every year. They would get season greetings cards, and they would get newsletters for one for the parents and one directly addressed for the children. And with what was discussed this morning, we had different experience. They were really liked the newsletters. Also the parents and also the children and the adolescents. So we had some feedback, and so we have some information. It's not that they were overwhelmed with information. It was really to the contrary, that they liked this information. I think it had a lot to do with the identification with the study.
Can you tell us about the validation of the study?
We paired this large representative study with a small validation study, 175 6-year-old children from the canton of Zurich. And what was the reason why we did that? We wanted to also collect behavioral data, because in a large representative study where we just have 1 hour of interviewing, you're restricted, to really collect behavioral data. Of course, we did an IQ test and certain other things, but it's primarily survey data. And the second idea we pursued was to measure selected concepts, important concepts, more thoroughly, more extensively.
What are the lessons learned from the COCON study?
I think, especially with these studies, having an analytical interest in life course trajectories, without deliberate precaution and appropriate measures, prospective longitudinal data collection, that means panel study, may run the risk of morphing into a normative sample. And that's what you really want to avoid, because this hampers the validity of your results. Secondly, the pairing of a large representative study relying on survey data with a small validation study collecting, in addition, behavior data is essential to assess the validity of both types of data. And third, I would say the multi-informant approach proves to be essential in assessing the perspective of actors acting not in isolation, but always in social relationships. And this is, of course, a core sociological assumption. And with this, I would like to end, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Buchmann, for this very interesting conversation. See you next time.